Alright, picture this. A prince who walked away from his palace, a former president who thrives on chaos, and a fire-breathing commentator who never bites his tongue. Sounds like the setup to a late-night joke, right? But this isn't comedy. It's the bizarre reality unfolding right now, where Prince Harry's name is being thrown into a fight that has nothing to do with crowns or castles, and everything to do with free speech. Because here's the twist. While regular people in Britain are being arrested over tweets, comedy sketches, even flags, Harry has become the lightning rod for a global debate. And some of the loudest voices, Donald Trump, Ben Shapiro, Nigel Farage, are suddenly circling his name like vultures. Shapiro even went so far as to suggest deporting him. Deporting a prince. You heard that right. Now before you laugh it off, here's the thing. It's not just trolling, it's a warning shot. Because when culture wars, censorship, and political theater collide, they don't just create headlines, they create targets. And somehow, Prince Harry is right in the middle of it all. But wait until you see how this free speech crisis is playing out in Britain, and why Harry has become its most unlikely symbol. In Britain today, the crisis isn't hidden in the shadows. It's unfolding in broad daylight. Ordinary people aren't just being silenced online, they're being dragged into courtrooms and police stations. Not for fraud, not for violence, not for corruption, but for words, tweets, jokes, opinions. Picture this. You post a comment about gender ideology, or question the latest government narrative, and instead of a reply from a stranger online, you get a knock at your door, sometimes from armed police. That's not an exaggeration, it's happening. Comedy writers like Graham Linehan, once celebrated for making millions laugh, have been hauled into court. Activists are arrested for hanging a flag. Citizens are treated like criminals because they voiced an unpopular thought. And the mainstream press? Silent, pretending nothing is wrong. This isn't the Britain people grew up believing in. The land of sharp debate, fearless satire, and comedy that punched up at power. No, today's Britain is a place where holding the wrong opinion might land you in handcuffs. And it's that dystopian shift that's pushing Harry's name into the crossfire. Because here's the irony. While everyday Brits are being punished for their speech, Prince Harry, a man who now lives in California, is free to fly in and out of the UK, all while embracing the very culture of censorship his critics say is destroying free expression. And that's exactly where this story takes its darkest turn. And if you want to see just how deep this crisis cuts, look no further than Graham Linehan. You probably know the name, the comedy writer behind some of Britain's sharpest, funniest shows. A man who once thrived on making people laugh is now being treated like a criminal. After years of being targeted for his outspoken views, Linehan finally hit a breaking point. Standing outside a courtroom, cameras rolling, he didn't crack a joke. He didn't even look angry. He just looked done. "I can't live in a country where comedy is criminalized," he said. His voice carried more exhaustion than outrage, like someone watching his home turn into a place he no longer recognized. That moment went viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it was raw, honest. A comedian forced into exile by a government that seems to fear laughter more than crime. And while Graham packs his bags for the US, determined to write his next sitcom in freedom, Britain loses yet another voice. But here's the kicker. His story wasn't covered on primetime news. No splashy headlines, no endless debates. Silent. And into that silence stepped voices across the Atlantic. People like Donald Trump, who looked at Britain's free speech meltdown and decided to make it his fight. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because while Britain's leaders stayed quiet, Donald Trump decided to speak up. During a meeting with Nigel Farage in the Oval Office, Trump leaned in and called it like he saw it. "Strange things are happening over there. It's not a good thing." Now, coming from anyone else, that might sound like casual commentary. But from Trump, it was a shot fired. This is the man who built his political brand on fighting political correctness, who turned free speech into a rallying cry for millions. So when he points a finger at Britain's censorship culture, it isn't background noise, it's a signal. Trump wasn't laughing it off either. He looked disturbed, almost baffled at the idea that comedians, writers, and citizens were being arrested for tweets. And he wasn't alone. His words opened the floodgates for America's most outspoken commentators to weigh in. That's when the fire really caught. And the man holding the match? Ben Shapiro. If Trump's comments were the warning shot, Ben Shapiro was the cannon blast. On Fox News, he tore into Britain's free speech crisis with his trademark speed and fire. But he didn't stop there. He aimed his sights directly at Prince Harry, and dropped the line that set social media ablaze. "We must deport Prince Harry," Shapiro declared, half mocking, half deadly serious. The studio laughed, the panel howled. But the message hit harder than anyone expected. Because behind the sarcasm was a brutal point. Harry isn't just some celebrity. He's become the face of a progressive elite that, in Shapiro's view, embraces censorship instead of freedom. And then came the jab that made headlines. Shapiro asked, "Do we also deport his balls?" A pointed shot at Meghan Markle, who critics say has Harry wrapped up tighter than Buckingham Palace security. The audience roared. The internet exploded. But underneath the humor, there was a raw frustration. A sense that figures like Harry, once symbols of tradition, are now cheerleaders for the very culture shutting down debate. In that moment, Harry went from a royal exile to a lightning rod in the free speech war. He wasn't just being mocked, he was being made into a symbol. And once you're a symbol, you're fair game. But while Trump and Shapiro made headlines, the real spark of resistance didn't come from Washington or Fox News. It came from a former Sky News journalist who turned her phone into a weapon, Hannah Kirkpatrick. On TikTok and X, she's become one of the loudest voices calling out Britain's censorship nightmare. Her videos are sharp, sarcastic, and impossible to ignore. One moment she's quoting headlines with the receipts right behind her. The next she's playing a skit where a fake government call center decides what speech gets approved. It's comedy and truth rolled into one, and it's going viral. But Hannah's rise hasn't been easy. Every time she posts, her inbox fills with warnings. Some Americans beg her not to fly back to the UK after visiting Florida, afraid she'll be arrested at Heathrow just for speaking her mind. She laughs it off, but the fear is real. She's already faced community guideline strikes for simply quoting articles, actual headlines, labeled as misinformation. So she adapted. She started disguising her commentary as jokes, using humor as her shield, and in doing so, she tapped into something bigger. A global audience ready to listen. Her followers aren't just Brits anymore. They're Americans, Canadians, Australians. People who see in her story a chilling preview of what might happen in their own countries if they stay silent. And while Hannah's videos spread across the internet like wildfire, the silence of Britain's mainstream media became deafening. And that's the part that cuts deepest. Because while Hannah Kirkpatrick's skits rack up millions of views, Britain's mainstream media stays eerily quiet. Stories that should dominate front pages. Comedians dragged into court, women arrested for flags, police showing up over tweets, barely get a mention. Take Graham Linehan's arrest. Here's a man whose sitcoms defined an entire era of British comedy, swarmed by police for his words. ITV, silent. BBC, barely a whisper. The tabloids, more interested in royal fashion than a free speech crisis at their own doorstep. It's not because the stories aren't newsworthy, it's because they don't fit the narrative. And that silence has consequences. A vacuum, a void, and who fills it? Independent journalists. YouTubers, podcasters, ordinary citizens with a phone and a Wi-Fi signal. That's why voices like Hannah's hit so hard. She's not reading from a teleprompter. She's speaking the truth people can see with their own eyes but aren't allowed to hear on TV. And the more the media tries to bury it, the louder the backlash grows. And now, thanks to that blackout, a surprising figure has stepped forward to carry Britain's free speech fight across the Atlantic. Nigel Farage. When the British press looked away, Nigel Farage did the opposite. He carried the fight straight into America's halls of power. At a U.S. congressional hearing, Farage laid it all out. No sugarcoating, no political spin, just a blunt account of what's happening on the ground in Britain. Citizens punished for jokes, comedians silenced, flags treated like threats. His testimony hit harder than anyone expected. Lawmakers who usually dismissed Farage as a provocateur suddenly sat up and listened, because the picture he painted wasn't abstract. It wasn't about culture wars or internet squabbles. It was about armed officers showing up at people's homes for expressing views that, just a few years ago, were completely mainstream. And here's the irony. While elected leaders in Britain pretend there's no crisis, Farage found a louder audience in Washington than in Westminster. For once, Americans seemed more invested in defending British freedoms than Britain's own government. That disconnect struck a nerve. Back home, ordinary Brits saw clips of Farage being cheered in Congress and asked themselves, why does it take a man like him, halfway across the world, to tell our story? Why aren't our leaders fighting for us? And that question, that uncomfortable, gnawing question, is where this controversy shifts from politics to something much bigger. By now, it's clear this isn't just about Prince Harry, or even Britain. It's about what happens when free speech erodes in plain sight. Because the truth is, once one democracy starts handcuffing comedians and hauling citizens into court for tweets, others are watching and taking notes. That's why Elon Musk's platform, X, has turned into something almost symbolic, a digital embassy for dissenters. British voices that would be buried at home are suddenly amplified worldwide. Hannah Kirkpatrick's skits, Graham Linehan's courtroom despair, they don't just circulate in London. They travel to New York, Los Angeles, Sydney. They go global, and that global attention raises uncomfortable questions. Is this Britain's future, or is it a warning of what could spread elsewhere? Americans watching these arrests play out online have started asking if the same could happen in their own backyards. And the uncomfortable answer is yes, it could. That's why Trump's comments mattered. That's why Shapiro's jokes stuck. They weren't just piling on Harry for the spectacle. They were tapping into a much deeper fear that Western freedoms are slipping, and the cracks are starting to show. And now, with Harry caught in the middle of it all, the question becomes unavoidable. Does he stay silent, or does he finally pick a side? Courtroom summons, just glossy magazine spreads and red carpet photo ops. And yet, the narrative his critics pin on him is clear. He represents the elite culture that silences dissent. So the question becomes impossible to ignore. Does Harry break the silence, defend free speech, and prove he isn't part of the machine? Or does he stay quiet and let himself become the face of Britain's censorship crisis? Because one thing is certain, this storm isn't going away. The comedians won't stop joking, the journalists won't stop posting, and the critics won't stop asking why freedom of speech, one of Britain's proudest traditions, now hangs by a thread. And as for Harry, his next move could decide whether he's remembered as just another exile chasing relevance, or as the prince who stood on the wrong side of history.